Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to another video. Cherry is officially out on Apple TV Plus, and I'm here to give you guys my spoiler for your review. Cherry is about a young man who's played by Tom Holland who has been scarred from war and now suffers a heroin addiction. He meets the love of his life only to risk losing her through a series of bad decisions and life-changing circumstances. He eventually gets himself into a position where he has to rob banks for money, and everything in his life in general just becomes a mess. Before I get into the good and the bad of this movie, I wanted to mention that this movie felt like the Russos really wanted to show that they could kind of make movies outside of just a kid genre for superheroes. It felt like after their blockbuster hit of Avengers Endgame, they wanted to try something completely different. And I felt like they didn't really need to show that. There's no reason for them to prove anything because Avengers Endgame was such a success. They got to stick to what they're good at. And I felt like this movie, most of the time, it was just them trying to prove to us how good they were outside of making superhero movies. But without wasting any more time, I want to get into the good of this movie. I think the best thing to come out of this movie is Tom Holland's performance for sure. This story tells the phases of a man's life after war, and Holland represents that super well through his acting. As a superhero fan, you can definitely see the Peter Parker in Tom Holland, even though he's playing such a raw and gritty character in this movie. And it's something to kind of have that you kind of have to get over. It's kind of a hurdle. As the story moves on and as we start to get to the military aspect, the Russo brothers' action side of their directing really shines. And so does Tom Holland's performance, because you kind of start to see that Peter Parker-esque kind of fade away, because even in the beginning of the movie, he plays a high school student with glasses on. He's basically a nerd, just like Peter Parker is. So I feel like we see a lot of that resemblance, but obviously as time goes on and as the movie goes forward, you definitely start to see that resemblance kind of dwindle away. And also one reason why it wasn't as big of a deal as it was to me as it was to other people was because I watched this movie called Devil All the Time. It's on Netflix, and I thought it was super dope to see him in The Devil All the Time. He played such a gritty character, and him and Ron Pattinson did so well bouncing off of each other. So just seeing that movie alone and seeing him fight and kind of curse a lot in that movie made this movie not as hard to get past all of those things of his character. But then again, it still was a hurdle that had to be made past. Moving past all of that, I think that one of the other biggest things in this movie that's super good is the slow pacing that kind of leads into the super harsh and brutal reality of war, as well as the aftermath of being in war and being in the army with that severe PTSD, and in this case, drug addiction. This movie was super raw and gritty, super down to earth, and I think it did a great job in showing that story and kind of expanding upon the journey that someone has to go through after they come home from war, especially if they come home from war broken and they have someone there that was waiting for them, and life turns into a snowball and everything just goes downhill at once because they can't really control their emotions. One thing I do want to applaud the Russos for in this movie is not only the awesome action sequences inside of the war section of the movie, but also showing the genuine side of drug addiction instead of sugarcoating it like a lot of other Hollywood movies do. Now I understand this is obviously much smaller than any other bigger films. It only hits select theaters. It wasn't such a big release. It came out on Apple TV a month after it came out on theaters, in select theaters, and so obviously they had a lot more freedom as to what they could show, and I think they took it in the right direction by not sugarcoating anything and kind of showing the raw details as to kind of what goes through someone's mind and what someone goes through in general, suffering from PTSD, and then off of that they're suffering a drug addiction. Alright, so now I'm going to go to the bad. Now, I want to quickly warn you guys that the bad in this movie, there's not too much, but the things that are bad really weigh down the movie a lot because they have such importance to the movie overall. So one of the biggest, weirdest things about this movie is that Tom Holland's character looks into the camera a lot, and it just feels super unnatural to me. So the movie is split into a few different parts, and each part kind of tells a different part of his life. So the first one is obviously him in high school. Second one is him going into war. And then there's the third, I think, fourth, and fifth one. I think there's 5 total, but I'm not 100% sure. The parts where he looks at the camera specifically are just super unnatural and weird. Now, the reason I bring up the sections of the movie is I feel like the better way to have done that is to kind of have him talk to the camera in the beginning of that part and then him talk to the camera at the end of the part. Because it feels like in the first 2 parts, he looks at the camera and talks at the camera a lot. Towards the middle and end of the movie, he barely looks at the camera and talks, and whenever he does, it's in super unnatural moments, and it doesn't seem like it's placed there. It just breaks up the tension of the scene and the sequence and the action overall. The movie is super duper long, and I think it's long for no reason at all. This movie is about 2 hours and 15 minutes, or no, 2 hours and 30 minutes, I think, and it could have been definitely cut down at least 45 minutes. An hour 45 for this movie would have been good enough. We would have gotten to see all the parts. I feel like they just made it a little bit too long. It just felt felt like there were too many parts that didn't necessarily belong there in the moment, whether it was not only him talking to the camera, but just random interactions with people that didn't really make sense to me. Another thing that I mentioned before was that this movie felt like the Russos were trying to prove too much to us that they could do other stuff outside of superhero movies. And I felt like they tried to be too artsy with the camera work. Now, usually, I'm a big fan of good camera work in movies. But in this movie, I feel like they choose a lot of weird things for us to look at and kind of put it into weird angles. They're trying to make us understand it more. But for me, it just distracted me from the whole entire movie. For example, the first part in the army, or actually most of the entirety of the army sequences, are all shot in a square format, whereas the rest of the movie is shot in a normal rectangle format. It makes no sense to me, and I literally had to zoom into the screen to make it better because it just looks super awkward. Another part where, I mean, I can't show this on screen now, but we get to see the inside of Tom Holland's bum. It is absolutely stupid. I don't understand why they had to do that. It just didn't make sense. A lot of their camera work choices were very questionable. And not just camera work, but just overall with the movie, it felt like they were trying to prove too much to us. And that really took away from the story as a whole. This basically connects with my issues with the length of the movie. Feels like they tried to go do too much camera work and all that kind of stuff. And made it too artsy as to what it was supposed to be, which is supposed to tell a raw, gritty, down-to-earth story of PTSD and drug addiction. And I don't know, it just felt like a lot of stuff was taken away from the movie because of the Russos' camera work and their decisions that they made about that kind of stuff. My final take for this movie is that it's definitely not a lighthearted movie for you to sit around on a comfy evening with your loved one to watch, but it's also not a severely depressing movie to completely ruin your day. But I think one thing is for sure with this movie is that you'll definitely be thinking about it after it's over. Whether it's about the questionable camera work choices or the awesome performance by Tom Holland, this movie is pretty good, and I still recommend that you check it out if you have Apple TV Plus. And I know there's other websites that you can obviously find it online. Overall, I'm going to give this movie a 7 out of 10. Not because of the story, not because of the camera work for sure, but I think everyone deserves to see Tom Holland's lifetime of a performance in this movie. And yeah, guys, that's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. That's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Peace.